Thank you again for joining us, Prabhu, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Babu. So, lesson 8 in the Founder Acharya Essentials series. To love is to cooperate. More than a farewell request, Srila Prabhupada's desire that his followers cooperate to spread Krishna consciousness everywhere remains a perennial call to action. By May 1977, Srila Prabhupada's health had been declining for months. It was time to return to Vrindavan, India, his home, as he called it, to recover or to depart. When his secretary suggested he make a will, Prabhupada agreed. For 7 years, Prabhupada had been training the members of ISKCON's governing body, Commission, GBC, to manage the society after his departure. To help them feel the gravity of their responsibility, Prabhupada requested they all come to Vrindavan to witness the will. Quote, because they love you, said his secretary, I'm sure they will all want to come and be with you. And of course, Prabhupada's secretary at the time was Tamal Krishna Maharaj. Prabhupada's reply was grave. Quote, your love for me will be shown by how much you cooperate to keep this institution together after I am gone, unquote. Notwithstanding Prabhupada's request, cooperation can be elusive in our age of quarrel. To see why, as well as what we can do to foster cooperation, we will sample Prabhupada's words on the subject, which reveal a simple yet challenging dialectic. You know, the dialectic, the most famous is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Let's see. I forget the other way you say it too. Anyway, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So Prabhupada's thesis is that we should cooperate. Despite Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's order that his leading disciples, quote, work conjointly and, quote, without any quarrel, that's from his last will, after his demise, their non-cooperation fragmented the Gaudiya mission and later disqualified most of them from helping Prabhupada revive it in the West. Determined that non-cooperation not similarly spoil ISKCON, Prabhupada often defined and tested his disciples' devotion in terms of their willingness to work together. Quote, when you do something in cooperation with the Lord, that is called bhakti, unquote. And, quote, the test of our actual dedication and sincerity to serve the spiritual master will be in this mutual cooperative spirit to push on this movement and not make factions and deviate, unquote. The day he signed his will, Prabhupada echoed his previous observation about cooperation. Quote, your love for me will be tested by how, after my departure, you maintain this institution. We have glamour and people are feeling our weight. This should be maintained, unquote. So that's the thesis. Prabhupada's thesis in the dialectic is that we cooperate. Now, what's the antithesis, the opposite? Don't expect utopia, this imaginary paradise. A couple of years after Prabhupada had formed the GBC, one of its members wrote to complain that impersonal dealings were dividing his colleagues. Prabhupada disagreed. Quote, "It is not so much that there may be some fault in our God brothers and God sisters, or because there may be some mismanagement or lack of cooperation, that this is due to being impersonalists. No, it is the nature of the living condition to always have some fault," unquote. And then I say, even in spiritual life, and then Prabhupada continues, quote, "Even in the spiritual world, there is some fault and envy, but it is not the same as material fault or material envy. It is transcendental because it is all based on Krishna." Sometimes when one devotee would serve Krishna very nicely, the others would say, "Oh, she has done so nicely. Now, let me do better for pleasing Krishna," unquote. That is envy, Prabhupada continued, but it is transcendental without malice, unquote. And then I say, envy without malice, how wonderful. Just like in the material world, everything runs on envy. And then if somebody does something better than you, you just want to somehow minimize that person or cut them down or even destroy them in the extreme. But in the spiritual world, someone does something nice for Krishna, people get jealous, but then they resolve, oh, now that's so nice. Let me do something even better that will please Krishna even more. And this way, there's an eternal competition to please Krishna, and also Krishna tries to please his devotees. Now, Prabhupada continues in this letter. So we shall not expect that anywhere there is any utopia. Rather, that is impersonalism. People should not expect that even in the Krishna consciousness society, there will be utopia. Because devotees are persons, there will always be some lacking. But the difference is that their lackings have become transcendental, because despite everything they may do, their topmost intention is to serve Krishna, unquote. Like a martial arts master using an opponent's negative energy to his advantage, Prabhupada then finished his point, challenging his disciple to see the positive. Quote, "The devotees of Krishna are the most exalted persons on this planet. Better than kings, all of them." So we should always remember that. And like the bumblebee, always look for the nectar and the best qualities of a person. Not like the utopians, who are like the flies who always go to the open sores or find the faults in a person. And because they cannot find any utopia, or because they cannot find anyone without faults, they want to become void, merge, nothing. They think that is utopia, to become void of personality. So if there are sometimes slight disagreements between devotees, it is not due to impersonalism, but it is because they are persons. And such disagreements should not be taken very seriously, unquote. So the thesis was cooperate. The antithesis, Prabhupada says, don't expect utopia. If Prabhupada's thesis is to cooperate and his antithesis not to expect utopia, then what is his synthesis, his resolution? Yeah, the other way to say it is point, counterpoint, resolution, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So what's the resolution? How do you resolve these opposing forces? As we might expect, it's easier said than done. The next section I call synthesis. Find unity in diversity. When another GBC man wrote to inform Prabhupada of more dissension in the ranks, Prabhupada's response was philosophical and proactive. Quote, material nature means dissension and disagreement. But for this Krishna consciousness movement, its success will depend on agreement, even though there are varieties of engagements. In the material world, there are varieties, but there is no agreement. In the spiritual world, there are varieties, but there is agreement. Unquote. Different individuals have different ways of performing devotional service. The agreement that harmonizes, quote, the varieties of engagements is their shared purpose to please Lord Krishna. Quote, the materialist cannot come into agreement with varieties. But if we keep Krishna in the center, then there will be agreement in varieties. This is called unity in diversity. So I just repeated what Prabhupada said. To illustrate, Prabhupada would sometimes give the example of concentric circles. No matter how many circles we draw, if they all share the same center, they never clash. In the same way, even when differences arise, if pleasing Krishna is our shared intention, we'll at least be able to, quote, agree to disagree and continue working cooperatively to serve the Lord. Prabhupada knew this would be an ongoing challenge. So the last part of that letter read, quote, I am therefore suggesting that all our men meet in Mayapur every year during the birth anniversary of Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. With all GBC and senior men present, we should discuss how to make unity in diversity. But if we fight on account of diversity, then it is simply the material platform. Please try to maintain the philosophy of unity in diversity. That will make our movement successful. Okay, so that's the synthesis, is find unity in diversity. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. So for the rest of the lesson, I just drill down on that, how to do that, how to find unity in diversity. So the next section I call unity in principle, diversity in application. Since achieving unity and diversity is the key to cooperation, Prabhupada's measure of our love for him, we need to dig deeper to understand how to find it. However diverse we may be, if we trust our mutual intentions to please Guru and Krishna, we'll be able to work together to identify timeless universal principles whose applications will vary according to, quote, time, candidate, and country, unquote. Prabhupada explains, quote, the teacher, Acharya, has to consider time, candidate, and country. What is possible in one country may not be possible in another. The Acharya's duty is to accept the essence of devotional service. It is not necessary that the rules and regulations followed in India be exactly the same as those in Europe, America, and other Western countries. We should not follow regulative principles without an effect, nor should we fail to accept the regulative principles. What is required is a special technique according to country, time, and candidate, unquote. Of course, even if the Acharya's, quote, special technique proves effective for spreading Krishna consciousness, advanced devotees may still disagree about its application. For example, while receiving a massage from his assistant one day, Prabhupada remarked, quote, My god brothers criticize me that I have allowed women to live in our temples. This is not done in India, but I have become successful because I made this adjustment, unquote. In the silence that followed, his assistant's curiosity compelled him to ask, quote, Prabhupada, how can we tell the difference between making an adjustment and changing a principle? Prabhupada closed his eyes as his assistant continued to rub his body. Finally, he opened his eyes and responded, quote, that requires a little intelligence, unquote. And then I say, a little intelligence and a lot of heart. I mean, even Prabhupada's own godbrothers didn't understand why Prabhupada was letting men and women serve together in his centers, because they were standing pat on a lower principle, which was a truism from Narada Muni about the butter pot and the fire. You put the butter pot too close to the fire, it's going to melt. Similarly, you put men and women too close together and there's going to be scandal. And scandals had already happened. And they were happening and they would happen. But Prabhupada, he wasn't going to deny half the human race access to Mahaprabhu's mercy. And he also knew that the men needed the inspiration of ladies to work. Most men need that, especially young men. In his commentary to Sri Chaitanya Chaitamrita Adi Leela, chapter 7, text 37, Prabhupada describes the compassionate intent of such intelligence, that intelligence which can distinguish between principles and details, and higher from lower principles. So here's how Prabhupada describes that in CC. Quote, an acharya should devise a means by which people may somehow or other come to Krishna consciousness. First, they should become Krishna conscious, and all the prescribed rules and regulations may later gradually be introduced. So the priority is on people becoming Krishna conscious, and the disciplines of bhakti they follow gradually. For example, this is still Prabhupada, since boys and girls in the Western countries freely intermingle, special concessions regarding their customs and habits are necessary to bring them to Krishna consciousness. The acharya must devise a means to bring them to devotional service. So that's exactly what Prabhupada did, unquote. For Prabhupada, bringing someone to devotional service was the highest principle, requiring bold applications for changing times. For instance, in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's Gaudiya mission, many devotees used to chant 64 rounds of the Hare Krishna mantra on their beads. Despite Prabhupada suggesting fewer rounds to his first followers, 32, then 25, they still looked perplexed. That would take hours. Prabhupada then declared, 16 rounds daily, the rock bottom minimum for his initiated disciples. When one of those early initiates later asked Prabhupada why he had asked them to chant so many rounds, then reduce the number, Prabhupada replied that he was, quote, experimenting to see what the devotees could do. To determine a principle's practical application, Prabhupada would often try something out and then, quote, judge by the result. In Bengali is phalena parachiyate. Judge a thing, you have to judge a thing by its result. Next section I call humility helps. At one point, while instructing Sanatana Goswami, Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu stopped to marvel at his humble disciple. Quote, since you possess Lord Krishna's potency, you certainly know these things. However, it is the nature of a sadhu to inquire. Although he knows these things, The sadhu inquires for the sake of strictness, unquote. Prabhupada wrote no commentary to this text, but later spoke about it. Quote, a sadhu, a saintly person, although he knows everything, still he remains very humble and tries to confirm from the higher authorities. I think this is right. Is it not right? He knows it is all right, but still he waits for the higher authority to confirm it. Strict in remembering his absolute smallness, strict in never presuming he knows everything, the humble devotee is always glad to hear deeper realizations from sincere devotees whom he regards as his prabhus or masters. Because he trusts the devotee's intentions, they trust his, and everyone is happy to cooperate with him, even if they sometimes disagree. That old saying, agreeing to disagree. That's only possible when people respect each other. In the Mahabharata, the model of the humble hero is King Yudhisthira, and the arrogant fool, King Duryodhana. When they were mere adolescents, their martial arts guru, Dronacharya, gave them each an assignment to test their character. To Yudhisthira, he commanded, bring me someone less than you. And to Duryodhana, bring me someone more than you. Even as the assignments were spoken, Duryodhana's mind was complaining. Why did Yudhisthira receive the easy task? How will I ever find anyone greater than me? Later that day, Duryodhana fulfilled his own prophecy by returning to his master alone. Quote, I'm sorry, Guru Maharaj. I could not find anyone greater than me. Drona raised his eyebrows, but kept silent. Twilight came and still no Yudhisthira. Finally at dusk, he returned, alone and disappointed. I'm sorry, Guru Maharaj. I looked high and low. Finally, I saw a man with some grain on a kadashi. I thought he was going to eat it, but then he fed it to his animal. So I gave up. How will I ever find anyone less than me? Drona smiled, as we might too. But am I more like Yudhisthira or Duryodhana? Sanatan or Satan? If I think there is no one with whom I need to check my understanding, no authority higher than myself, then I need to give up the arrogance of Duryodhana and embrace the humility of Yudhisthira. Genuine humility enables us to appreciate and learn from all devotees and cooperate with them to please Srila Prabhupada, Guru, and Krishna. So now I have to give you a heads up. It's only one more section before we end, so be thinking about questions and comments. The last section I call One Last Word. On March 16th, 1976, in the holy land of Sridham, Mayapur, along the Ganges' green expanse, dozens of young Americans crowded into Srila Prabhupada's room at ISKCON's international headquarters. He thanked them for cooperating to profusely distribute his books for the benefit of suffering humanity. This was the famous Radha Damodar Brahmachari traveling parties. There was about 100 of them operating out of 7 or 8 buses, former Greyhound buses converted into traveling temples. So they won the marathon in 75 December. So in 76 for the Mayapur festival, Vrindavan. In those days, we used to go to Vrindavan first, then Mayapur. So the head of the party, Vishnu Jan, or Tamal Krishna Maharaj, actually, he gave his men a reward. He said, for winning the marathon, we're all going to go to India and you're all going to have a personal darshan with Srila Prabhupada. So they did. And it's interesting that Prabhupada, you're going to hear now how he chose to speak about cooperation, not just patting them on the back for distributing his books, which he might well have done, but he wanted to thank them for a greater virtue, which he, Prabhupada, knew would keep ISKCON alive and together. So here's what Prabhupada said, one especially telling excerpt. Quote, Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he is God himself, Krishna himself. He felt alone, unable to do this task. He felt. So this is the position. You are cooperating, therefore I am getting the credit. Otherwise, alone, what could I do? Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself wanted our cooperation. He is God, Krishna, and therefore cooperation is a very important thing. Nobody should think that I have got so great ability. I can do. No. It is simply by cooperation we can do very big thing. United we stand, divided we fall. Sankirtan. Sankirtan means many combined together, chanting. That is Sankirtan. Otherwise, Kirtan. Sankirtan means many, many combined together. That is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's mission. So that was the last word from Prabhupada. Cooperation. That's the key to finding unity and diversity. Okay, so I'll be very happy to hear your questions and comments now. And let me just read you a little preview of perhaps my favorite lesson. Tonight's lesson was the most intense, and I think our questions will probably bear that out. But next week is my favorite. Transition. Before we look at different ways to access and develop a personal loving relationship with Srila Prabhupada, in lesson 9, we'll examine and clear up some misunderstandings about him. I call the lesson, quote, fictional Prabhupads. And you'll learn when we do the lesson what I mean by that, fictional. Make-believe, imaginary, or just wrong-headed notions of Prabhupada. All right, Prabhus, let's go to the Q&A.
Hare Krishna. Thank you for this very good lecture, Prabhu. So my question was about the 64 rounds. Was it expected in Gaudiya Mutt that, like, when we take initiation, we have to, take an oath that we're going to do 16 rounds every day? Did they have to do 64 rounds?
No, they didn't, unless they were staying back at the mutt. Everybody had a particular tapasya. So for preachers, full-time preachers, and also full-time householders who were engaged with family and business and children, they had to chant 16. But those who were staying back to maintain the mutt, to purify their consciousness, because they had more time at their disposal, they were required to do 64. So it really depended on the situation. Now, Prabhupada, he didn't make a distinction like that. Because actually from day one, the way Prabhupada set up ISKCON was that everybody's a preacher. even if you were, cleaning the temple or doing artis, the mood was to make the temple or the center so attractive that when when the preachers met people, they could bring them back to a nice place. So everybody was in that way connected with the preaching. So yeah, Hari Shari told us that Prabhupada told him I chanted my 16 rounds by doing 4 upon rising, 4 before breakfast, 4 before midday meal, and 4 before evening snack. So 4 times 4 is 16, and that's how he did his 16 rounds. And that's pretty shrewd, because if you make that vow, and you got to eat because you get hungry, so you're going to make sure you do those rounds, if only just to eat. But of course, Prabhupada was on a platform higher than that. But that's how he divided up his rounds, because perhaps there wasn't all the time in the early morning, with family and then business and then the heat of the day and business. But he did it very intelligently. And so when Prabhupada told the first aspirants about 64 rounds, Prabhupada didn't mention that in the beginning. He just said that Gaudiya Math, many of my godbrothers chanted 64 rounds. He did tell them about the different standards for different devotees. And the devotees couldn't believe it. So, and Prabhupada saw that they were incredulous. So then Prabhupada said, so I think you can do 32 rounds. And then still they were like, what? 32 rounds? That's going to take us all day. We'll never be able to do anything else. And only then did Prabhupada say, okay, 16 rounds minimum, rock bottom, no less. And that became the standard for ISKCON. Good question.
So Prabhupada, I was a follow-up question on that. Does when Prabhupada took sannyas and he was in Vrindavan, was he doing 16 still, or was he doing more? Any idea?
Well, he was still his chanting, as he writes in the Bhagavatam, his chanting was in writing. Prabhupada makes that clear in one purport. I forget the number, the chapter, and the verse, but purport that Vyasadeva, he was chanting and writing. Yeah, Prabhupada talks about how Vyasadeva was chanting and writing. So even though Prabhupada was all alone, Radha Damodar rooms, and then we had enough funds, from donations, he had to do everything himself. He had to write, he had to collect the donations to get the printing going, and travel, and he wasn't even, properly eating. He was saving every pice. So he was not idle. He was the embodiment of Rupa Goswami's avyartha kalatvam, never wastes a moment in Krishna service. Yeah. So that's what he was doing. And that was the standard. He maintained that same standard that he had before, and then that ended up being the standard for ISKCON.
So the 64 rounds I think that comes from Chaitanya Charitamrita, isn't it? That Chaitanya Mahaprabhu expected 1 lakh names to be taken every day. I mean, that was his expectation from his devotees.
I don't know if he expected that, but Raghunath Das was famous for that. Or Rupa Goswami, yeah. Yeah, it was, when Mahaprabhu was walking among the devotees, it was, the austerity was, well, of course, we just passed, was it today or yesterday? Sunday. Was it Sunday? Yeah, Sunday was the intersection of Easter and the Avirbhav, the Advent day of Srivas Thakur. Very auspicious intersection of events. And of course, Mahaprabhu started the Sankirtan movement in the house in Srivasangan in Mayapur. So that was their outreach, it was their preaching. And it wasn't until Mahaprabhu disappeared, until, like I told in lesson 2, until a dozen years had passed after Mahaprabhu disappeared, that there was actually something organized, Sangha, the Sri Vishwa Vaishnava Raj Sabha. So, yeah, it wasn't that that Mahaprabhu had an institution and he required, this and that from the people in his institution. No, he was just sweeping everybody up in his mood of Radha's love for Krishna and establishing the Yuga Dharma of chanting Hare Krishna. But yeah, there were examples of extreme austerity and extreme rasa tasting, Rupa Goswami. So that's about all I can say on that.
Prabhupada always had his beat back when it was a Vanaprastha Grahastha. He always chanted. I don't know if he chanted 16 or 64, but there's a famous saying that when Los Angeles, one time he finished his 16 round, he said, put his beads down, I have done my 16 round, I can do what damn thing I want to do.
Yeah, Chuda Kirti. Chuda Kirti was there.
Yeah. So
Prabhupada's Prabhupada's making fun of us.
Yeah.
That was a joke.
So, when Prabhupada always emphasized Sankhya Purvak, a lot of his lectures and purports, he talks about how the Goswamis have used to count how much they chant.
Yeah, Prabhupada, he never was idle. At the very least, yeah, as you say, he always had his hand in his bead bag. He was, the holy name was always sort of in his mind or in his breath or out loud. Kirtaniyak Sada Hari. Yeah, he was the founder acharya, setting the example. There was no difference between his public and private life. It's not that, he put his beads down and then he put his leg up on the couch and then he watched TV or something. No. Prabhupada was 100% Krishna consciousness 24/7. Jai. Okay. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Prabhu, I had a quick question. How much of the failures of Prabhupada's godbrothers to cooperate and behave in the manner that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur recommended influenced him in how he set up ISKCON and purposefully said, the way you cooperate will show how much you love me?
Yeah, that's certainly, that was Prabhupada's concern, that after he would leave, that the same thing would happen as happened to the Gaudiya Math. And that's why 7 years before he left, he started training a group of people to take over the management, the GBC, whereas it was only in the last, 48 hours of his life that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta ordered them. He didn't recommend, he ordered them. He ordered them to form a governing body, work cooperatively, keep initiating, but you don't, as I've said before, you don't replace a founder acharya. You just cooperate to serve the mission. They didn't do that. So Prabhupada was determined that what happened to his, and it's very plain in some CC purports, where Prabhupada wrote some very heavy things about how his godbrothers became asara, useless. And at other times he was more generous, but he didn't want what happened to them to happen to ISKCON. So he was training since 1970. The very month I joined, he's formalized, he put in writing under the document direction of management the names of the GBCs then, and most of them were householders, married people. And then he was training them. He was grooming them to take over the management. And even grooming them, he knew these people are very neophyte. But because of his sterling example and powerful preaching, even though we were neophyte, the movement survived, the cataclysms of the 1980s by the structure Prabhupada had put in place with the governing body. So that's Prabhupada's mercy on us. Yeah, he was always thinking of that. That's why he gave that grave answer to Tamal Krishna Maharaj, who said, "Oh, I'm sure they'll come, Srila Prabhupada. They love you so much." Prabhupada was very grave. "Your love for me will be shown by how you cooperate to keep this institution together after I'm gone." And then he said a similar thing the day he signed the will. And then he said, not like Gaudiya Math, after Guru Maharaj left, so many, quote, acharyas came up. What he meant by that was not that we aren't supposed to become acharyas, but we're not supposed to try to replace the founder acharya. So he meant so many imitation founder acharyas came up because there were different parties competing for that. So, we've gone through our traumas and dramas, and many issues are still very contentious. We don't want to fragment ISKCON because there's disagreements. Prabhupada set up a system of management. Majority rules in the GBC, and then if the resolution that's passed is found not to work, then you can change it. It's like they do in the Congress. They pass a law, and then somehow it's abused, or there's a loophole, or it becomes out of date, and then they pass another law. So we can. This is not demon crazy, but it's enlightened democracy. That's the way Prabhupada set up ISKCON. So let's do it. And it's all based on cooperation, finding unity and diversity, and basically treating each other with respect, love, and trust. Takes practice in Kali Yuga, the age of no trust and no cooperation, and my way or the highway. So we have to always push back against the tide of Kali Yuga by remembering Prabhupada's instructions. Okay. Knoxville again has not come. I think because they know they're going to get the same series too. They don't want to hear all the lessons. Oh, you know what I told them too? I gave them a little disappointing news, which I actually have to break to you too. After we finish the Essential series, we were going to go on and do the Leelas series, but I've been getting so much service from my superiors that we're going to have to, for the summer, we're going to have to break and then resume with you folks the Leela series in the fall, just like we're going to have to resume the Essential series with Knoxville in the fall, because I just can't do it. I've been given some very time-sensitive kind of emergency service. It's exciting, but I just can't do everything. So we have, I think, two more lessons after this tonight, and then we'll have to break. So, anything from the ladies?
Hare Krishna, Danvat Pranam.
Dandavat Pranam.
My question to you is, why majority rules? Why not consensus? Why GBC functions on the principle of democracy?
Because Well, it's not just an up or down vote with no discussion. Just like the same thing with, I gave the analogy of the Congress. Before these bills are voted on, there's intense discussion and there's give and take. Just like right now, what's the thing, Biden's $2 trillion or almost $3 trillion latest bill. He's trying to get buy-in from Republicans. Doesn't look like it's going to happen. But in the Vaishnav circle, at least we have a fighting chance because, as Prabhupada said in that letter to Atreya Rishi, as long as we have a common center, we can have, even though we have varieties of opinions, we can have agreement. And that happens when we all trust that we all have the same motives to please Prabhupada and Guru and Krishna and spread Krishna consciousness. So it's not that there's just a bald, stark, impersonal kind of vote and we win, you lose. That's what they call it, a zero-sum game. No, that's why there's GBC deputies, for example. The GBC deputies, they vet all the resolutions, they review them, and then they try to help the people who are proposing the resolutions to frame them in such a way so that the GBC can clearly understand the benefit of the resolutions. And then even then, when the GBC are discussing the proposed resolutions, they do this thing called PNI. They consider the positive aspects of the resolution, the N, the negatives, and then they consider things that are just interesting to them. And then they take a vote after thoroughly discussing and debating, intense debating. So yeah, there's an attempt to come to a consensus, but at the end of the day, life goes on, you have to do something. And so Prabhupada said, take a vote, and the majority rules. And then if it doesn't work, then, as I said, then amend it later, next year. Or we have this thing now called, that I'm part of this thing called Sabha, where we look at it, resolutions that were rejected, perhaps, voted down, and resolutions that were proposed. And the GBC created our body as a check and balance on them, because we don't have any positions in ISKCON. We're just sort of a body of different constituencies in ISKCON. There's sannyasis, there's gurus, there's old people, there's young people, there's ladies, gents, that we represent different geographic regions. So the GBC created us to be a kind of check and balance on what they do. And then if they push something through, and then before it's even published, well, first it goes to the lawyer, the GBC, the lawyer, the attorney, to see if there's anything that's not legal about it. And then it goes to us. And then if we look at it and we really have a problem with it, the GBC has empowered us to send it back to them for work. We can tell them, I'm sorry, if this stands, if this resolution stands, consider these consequences. And ultimately, they have the final say. But at least they created us to give them feedback on what they're doing, because they know that, maybe they're not in touch as much with devotees as they could be, and maybe we are. So anyway, we'll see. We're kind of new, but that's the idea, and we're developing a relationship with the GBC. So at the end of the day, that's the way Prabhupada did it. You can debate, you can discuss, but Prabhupada would sit in on these meetings himself, and he would observe how the votes went.
He voted himself.
And he voted himself. But first, he was the last one. He looked to see which way the wind was blowing. And then he'd vote with the majority, just to seal the majority, to make sure it was decisive. And then, okay.
And it is 51-49 majority or 75-25.
I don't think, no,
What
it
is
wasn't like this. It wasn't like the Senate is today, 50-50 with Kamala Harris, splitting the different, or no, not like that. But he just wanted to make the point, okay, let's just do it. Let's experiment. Let's try it out. Let's see how it works. And we can always amend it. Okay.
Thank you, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. So yeah, next week we look at these fictional Prabhupads. We look at four, and it's by no means exhaustive, the list, but we look at 4 impersonal fictions, false Prabhupads, and 4 sentimental fictions, 4 sentimental versions of Prabhupada. And they're all fictions, but there's some of them, it's tricky. This is why I like this lesson, because some of them are obviously fictional, not true. And some of them seem true, but you have to look closer to see how they're not true. So it's, I really like this lesson. Okay.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, Dandavat Pranam. Madhav Das, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So my question is, so a dissension or having different view about a given subject matter, it is good or bad?
It depends on the motive.
But how would one we know the motive? If I have some motive in my inside, how can you figure out what is my motive in that discussion? How?
Yeah. Well, sometimes you don't even know. Sometimes you don't even know until you try out your way. That's why Prabhupada himself, even sometimes, he would try things, and then sometimes they'd work, and then until they didn't work. And then Prabhupada would stop it. So he would even quote that Bengali saying, Phalena parachiyate, you have to judge a thing by its result. So he experimented with, he threw out the number 32 and then down to 25. And then when he saw the devotees were still shaking their heads, he said, okay, 16, rock bottom. So unity and diversity is, there's a such thing as healthy unity and unhealthy unity, and healthy diversity and unhealthy diversity. Okay, so what's healthy unity? Healthy unity is when we're all on the same team and our motives are really to please Prabhupada and Guru and Krishna and advance the movement. And unhealthy unity, where is in the name of that, in the name of all being on the same page, there's really no room for discussion and dissenting opinion, which is unhealthy. In that back and forth of different opinions, that's where you can actually reach some kind of healthy consensus, or at least a healthy, good majority. And then a healthy diversity is when there is dissent, but at the end of the day, everybody cooperates with the system that Prabhupada sets up. And we go along with, the majority rules that we tried out, and we're good citizens. The unhealthy diversity is, in the name of diversity, I want to do something that's completely out of bounds, out of the perimeter of bhakti. I don't want to follow regulative principles. I don't want to worship the deities, but I still want to call it bhakti. That's not diversity, that's perversity. So it takes some maturity to understand what's healthy and what's unhealthy. And it takes a lot of soul searching to know one's own motives. And that's best discerned, best determined among friends, among people we trust, even if we disagree with them. And even if they sometimes disagree with us. Mainly, we love and trust each other's motives, that we want to become Krishna conscious individually, and we want to share Krishna consciousness with as many people as we can. So,
Thank you.
All right, Prabhu. Thank you. Are we ready for Nishringa prayers? Or are there any more questions?
Are there
Comments?
any other questions for Prabhu? Okay, no other questions. Then Amit Bhaiya, can the girls sing their Shinga prayer?
Namaste Narasimhaya. Namaste Narasimhaya. Praladeladedaine. Praladeladedaine. Hiranyakashipu raksha. Hiranyakashipu raksha. Shrilatankanakaraye. Shrilatankanakaraye. Ito Narasimha Parato Narasimha. Ito Narasimha Parato Narasimha. Yato yato yami tato Narasimha. Yato yato yami tato Narasimha. Bahe Narasimha Hridaye Narasimha. Bahe Narasimha Hridaye Narasimha. Narasimha Madim Sharanam Prapade. Narasimha Madim Sharanam Prapade. Tava Kare Kamala Kare Nakamadhuta Shingam. Lalita Hiranyakashipu Tanuvringa. Keshavadita Narahari Rupa Sanya Jagadisha Hare. Jaya Jagadisha Hare. Tapakare Kamala Pare Naka Madhuta Shinga. Nalita Kashipu Tanuvringa. Keshavadita Narari Rupa Jaya Jagadisha Hare. Jaya Jagadisha Hare. Jaya Jagadisha Hare. Jaya Narasimha 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 Jaya Pranamara 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Jaya Prabhupada 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 Jaya Jaya नरसिंह भगवान की
जय।
जय। हरे कृष्णा
Hare
हरे
Krishna.
बोल, हरे बोल।
Thank you, ladies. So that concludes this evening's program. I will ask, will humbly request that you guys, that everyone keeps my mommy in prayer, in your prayers, as she's still battling COVID in the ICU unit. So I'm sure all the prayers will be greatly appreciated.
Hare Krishna.
So with that, we'll conclude the program with the Vaishnava Pranam prayer.
And tomorrow program start at 8.
Vanchakalpatarubhyascha
Vanchakalptarubhyascha
Patithanam
pavanebhyo
pavanebhyo
Vaishnavebhyo namo
Vaishnavebhyo
namo.
Pamanebhyo
Hare
Vaishnavebhyo namo
Hare
namah.
Krishna.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.
Hari
Thank
bol.
you, Prabhu.
Hare
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Prabhu. Thank you.
Hare Krishna.
Hare
Hare